Chapter 10. Saved from Children and Rats. My sorrowful whispers were interrupted by the crunch of a huge foot about to come down on top of me. I screamed as loudly as my lungs would let me. "Stop! No! Please! I'm down here!" The huge creature stopped in his tracks and looked around him on the ground until he caught sight of me. He knelt down and studied me, much as I would have looked down to see a strange insect on the ground. Then he reached down and picked me up, gripping me across my waist between his thumb and middle finger. He slowly brought me up to his eye level to study me. Hoping and praying that all he wanted to do was look, I decided not to struggle, even though I was dangling in the air 60 feet above the ground. I raised my eyes towards heaven, clasped my hands, and whispered some prayers, as if to show him I was a peace-loving creature. He seemed pleased with my gestures, even though he didn't understand the words I was speaking. When his fingers began hurting me, I began to groan and shed tears, pointing to my sides, which were being pinched. He seemed to understand what I was trying to say, for he lifted up the flap on his jacket pocket and gently put me inside. Then he ran to bring me to his master, who was the farmer I had first seen in the field. The farmer stood me in the palm of his left hand, and, with a piece of straw the size of an Englishman's cane, he lifted up the flap of my jacket. "Now what kind of covering has nature given to this strange creature?" he seemed to ask. Then he blew my hair aside. "And what does its face look like?" When he still couldn't figure what I was, he gently put me on the ground on all fours. But I stood up and walked slowly back and forth to show him I wasn't a four-legged creature, and I wasn't trying to run away. By now, all the other workers had gathered around me in a circle to watch me move. I took off my hat and bowed low to the farmer. Then I took a purse of gold from my pocket and placed it in his open palm. He brought the pouch up close to his eyes, but couldn't figure out what it was. He jabbed it with a pin to see if it moved, but it didn't. I signaled to him to lay his hand flat on the ground, which he did. I then opened the purse and poured all the gold into his palm. He wet the tip of his little finger with his tongue and dabbed at his palm to pick up some of the gold, but he had no idea what it was. He signaled me to put the gold back into the pouch, which I did. The farmer was convinced by now that I was a sane, thinking creature, not some insect or animal newly dug up from the earth. He spoke many words to me, but they came out sounding like booming thunder. While I answered as loudly as I could and in many different languages as I knew, we still couldn't understand each other. In a while he sent his servants back to work, then spread his handkerchief on the ground and signaled for me to step into it. This wasn't difficult, for the cloth was only 1 foot thick. I feared I might fall if I stood straight up, so I stretched out full length on the handkerchief and was wrapped up and carried to the farmhouse. The farmer gently placed me on a table and showed me to his wife, who took one look at me and screamed. I was even more frightened, however, of the table itself, which was 30 feet up from the floor. When lunchtime came, the farmer's wife brought in a dish of meat 24 feet across. Two of the family's 3 children came to the table, a boy of 10 and a girl of 9, and watched as their mother mashed a bit of meat for me on a small plate and added some crumbled bread. I bowed to the woman as my way of saying thanks. Then I took a knife and fork from my pocket and began to eat. The entire family watched with delight. When I was offered a drink from the smallest cup they had, I barely managed to lift it with both my hands, since it held 2 gallons. But it was a welcome drink, tasting much like cider. The farmer then motioned for me to come close to his plate. As I made my way there, trying to avoid platters and glasses and silver, which were like mountains in my path, I stumbled against a crust of bread and fell flat on my face. But I wasn't hurt, and got up immediately. I met greater trouble, however, when I passed by the plate of the farmer's 10-year-old son, who seized me by the legs and lifted me high in the air above his head. The farmer came to my rescue and snatched me from him, then gave the boy a hard slap on the hand and ordered him, "Leave the table at once. I'll punish you when I finish my meal." "Please, master," I begged, falling to my knees and talking in as much sign language as I could. "He's only a child. I'm certain he didn't mean to hurt me." I did this actually because I didn't want to make an enemy of the child, who might get back at me when his father wasn't around. After dinner, a servant brought in the family's 1-year-old baby. When he saw me, he reached out his hand for this new toy and let out a scream, but he couldn't reach me. To quiet him, the mother picked me up and placed me gently in his hand. The baby squeezed me tightly across the middle, then and immediately put my head in his mouth. I let out such a terrifying roar that the baby dropped me. If the mother hadn't spread her apron to catch me, I surely would have broken my neck. Her kindness continued after dinner when, seeing me yawn and start to close my eyes, she put me on her bed and covered me with a clean white handkerchief, which was large enough to hang as a sail on the largest warship in the British fleet. I slept for 2 hours and awoke feeling refreshed. I opened my eyes and looked at the bed in which I had slept. It was 60 feet wide. I looked down. It was 24 feet above the floor. I didn't have too much time to study the room, for I was suddenly attacked from both sides by two giant rats, the size of large dogs. One came at my face, while the other jumped on my neck. I quickly drew my sword and ripped open the belly of one rat before he could sink his teeth into my throat. Seeing his comrade fall dead, the other rat turned to flee, but not before I managed to cut deeply into his back as he ran. I got up, then walked around on the bed to catch my breath. I looked at the dead rat and saw that its tail alone was 6 feet long. When the farmer's wife came into the room, a while later, she was horrified to see blood all over the bed and all over me. Fearing that I had been injured, she picked me up in her hand and brought me close to her face, but I smiled at her and pointed to the dead rat on the bed. She sighed with relief, then called for her maid to throw away the dead rat and clean up the room while she took me out to her garden for some fresh air.